Alright, so we're going to be doing an updated PlayStation 2 Game Collection. Now I have 35 PlayStation 2 games, but the game that we lost is Cars, and the new game arrivals is another Gran Theft Auto San Andreas and Jeopardy. It's going to be freaking epic. Now let's get on to this video. It's going to be a long video. So first off is Ncaa Football 2004. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Yeah. Next up is Madden NFL 2010. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. It's my first Madden NFL game. Next up is Nascar 2007. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Tiger Woods PGA Tour 2006. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is NBA Live 2006. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever, but the trailers mess up, as you can see. Otherwise, the game works. Next up, I have two Gran Theft Auto 3s. They both work, but this one has some issues with reading the disc. And this one has no issues whatsoever. Yeah, so once again, I have two Gran Theft Auto 3s. Both work, as you can see. Now let's move on to our next game. Next up is Nascar 2008. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Tiger Woods PGA Tour 2004. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Ncaa Football 2007. It works perfectly fine, but it takes too long to load at the start of the beginning of the game. Next up is Grand Theft Auto Vice City Stories. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Major League Baseball 2K5, which has a DVD and a regular game in it. They both work perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is NCAA March Madness 2005. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is NASCAR 2005 Chase for the Cup. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is the Simpsons Road Rage. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. It is my first Simpsons game. Next up is Mortal Kombat Armageddon. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Grand Theft Auto Vice City. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Tiger Woods PGA Tour 2003. It works, but has some problems loading the game. Next up is Street Thrills. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Metal Gear Solid 2. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Lego Star Wars 2, the original trilogy. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is NHL 2004. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Madden NFL 2005. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Ncaa, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Ice Age 2, The Meltdown. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Lego Star Wars, the video game. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Final Fantasy X. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Super Trucks Racing. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is The Sims 2. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is MX World Tour featuring Jamie Little. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. Next up is Jeopardy. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever, and it is my first Jeopardy game for the PS2. And last but not least, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. It works perfectly fine, no issues whatsoever. So these are the top PlayStation 2 games ever yet. Now that's going to do with me with my updated PlayStation 2 game collection. This is Dad's account. Thank you for watching. I hope you like, subscribe, and comment. See you again in the next video for more of your favorite reviews, compilations, camera tests, and more.